For 60 years, Americans were told whole milk was bad for them. The science has quietly shifted. Low-fat dietary guidelines dominated nutrition policy for most of the 20th century. The question is not which looks different. It is what the research actually says about each one. The 60-year fat myth. Whole milk versus skim milk. This is grocery science. Today we examine what the evidence actually says about fat and dairy. Dietary fat guidance has shifted significantly over the past 6 decades, and the milk debate is at the center. In January 2026, updated US Dietary Guidelines officially endorsed full-fat dairy as an acceptable choice. The Whole Milk for Healthy Kids Act passed with bipartisan support, returning whole milk to school menus. To understand why this matters, we need to go back to where the low-fat advice came from. In the 1950s, a researcher proposed that dietary fat caused heart disease. The hypothesis was based on a cross-country correlation of fat consumption and heart disease mortality data. Critics later noted the original analysis excluded countries whose data did not fit the proposed pattern. By the late 1970s, the diet-heart hypothesis had influenced official U.S. dietary policy before definitive evidence existed. The 1980 Dietary Guidelines recommended reducing fat, including saturated fat from dairy and meat. The food industry replaced fat with sugar and refined carbohydrates in low-fat reformulations. Low-fat yogurt, sugar in second position. Removing fat required adding sugar and stabilizers to maintain texture and palatability. U.S. obesity rates rose consistently during the decades of low-fat dietary guidance. Researchers have since questioned whether observational data ever supported the fat is bad conclusion. A large randomized trial of low-fat diets in women found no significant reduction in heart disease. After 8 years, the low-fat dietary group showed no significant cardiovascular benefit over controls. The scientific consensus on dietary fat has quietly shifted, but public perception has not kept pace. Whole milk is approximately 87% water, 3.5% fat, 3.3% protein, and 4.8% lactose. Fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K2 are carried in the fat fraction of milk and are removed in skim. Skim milk is produced by centrifugation. The fat layer, along with fat-carried nutrients, is separated out. Some vitamins are added back through fortification, but not in the same food matrix as whole milk. The food matrix determines how nutrients are absorbed, not just what nutrients are present. Calcium in dairy is absorbed more efficiently than supplemental calcium, regardless of fat content. Whole milk contains conjugated linoleic acid, a naturally occurring fatty acid studied for metabolic effects. CLA in whole dairy has been associated with improved body composition in some human studies. Whole milk contains the milk-fat globule membrane, a bioactive structure absent from skim milk. Saturated fat in whole milk includes short-chain fatty acids that feed beneficial gut bacteria. Saturated fat in whole milk is biochemically distinct from industrial trans fats, which were often conflated in early research. A meta-analysis of 15 prospective studies found dairy fat was not associated with cardiovascular mortality. Whole milk contains phospholipids important for cell membranes and cognitive function. Major pediatric bodies recommend whole milk for children under 2. Fat is critical for brain development. Brain myelination, a fat-dependent process, is most active during the first 2 years of life. A Swedish cohort study of 45,000 adults found high-fat dairy intake associated with lower obesity risk. Those with the highest full-fat dairy intake had lower central obesity, the opposite of what was expected. Full-fat dairy activates satiety hormones, including peptide YY, potentially reducing total food intake. A meta-analysis found full-fat dairy intake inversely associated with type 2 diabetes risk. Countries with among the highest per capita whole dairy consumption do not have the highest cardiovascular rates. The PUR study of 136,000 people across 18 countries found full-fat dairy associated with lower mortality. 3 or more daily dairy servings were associated with 22% lower cardiovascular mortality in PUR. These are observational studies. Dietary pattern, socioeconomic factors, and exercise all confound the findings. Nutrition science increasingly recognizes that fat type and food source matter more than total fat intake. When dairy fat is removed, the replacement matters. Refined carbohydrates worsen outcomes, but unsaturated fats may not. The nutrient replacement question is central. Low fat does not mean health benefit if sugar fills the gap. Skim milk is fortified with added vitamin D, but vitamin D absorption is improved by the presence of fat. A 2015 study found vitamin D from food was absorbed 32% more effectively when consumed with fat. Skim milk adds fat-soluble vitamin D back, but removes the fat needed to absorb it efficiently. Several pediatric bodies have revisited low-fat dairy recommendations for school-aged children. In 2024, the FDA approved a qualified health claim for yogurt and diabetes regardless of fat level. The 2025 dietary guidelines shifted. Full-fat dairy is now within the recommended dietary pattern. Welcome to the dairy chapter. Individual context matters. Those managing specific cardiovascular conditions should consult a physician. The evidence applies to whole dairy foods, not to processed dairy products with added sugars. Sweetened low-fat yogurt often contains more sugar than plain whole-fat yogurt. The fat is the wrong concern. Fermented dairy, like cheese, shows different metabolic effects than unfermented high-fat dairy products. Whole milk and skim milk are comparably priced, making either accessible regardless of income level. The caloric difference is real, 150 versus 83 calories per cup. Quantity context still applies. No single food determines health outcomes. The overall dietary pattern over years is what matters most. Mediterranean and Nordic diets, both associated with longevity, include full-fat dairy without restriction. US schools may now offer whole and 2% milk under the Whole Milk for Healthy Kids Act. Nutrition science rarely produces certainty. The dairy debate reflects genuine scientific complexity. 3 things the evidence supports: fat-soluble nutrient absorption, satiety effect, and dietary pattern context. For most healthy adults, current evidence does not support avoiding whole dairy for cardiovascular reasons. The most important question is not whole versus skim. It is what you eat when you choose differently. The science of milk fat is more complex and more favorable than 60 years of guidance suggested. Nutrition science evolves. What was once considered settled is now actively being revised. Policy changes follow evidence, but the lag between research findings and public guidance can be decades. Beyond single nutrients, food matrices, and dietary patterns, the broader lesson is that single nutrient thinking led nutrition science astray for decades. You now have the evidence. The choice between whole and skim milk is yours to make. At Grocery Science, we examine food through the lens of available evidence, not through marketing. Coming next, what is really inside protein bars, deli meats, fruit juice, and supplements? Stay curious. Stay informed. Subscribe for one evidence-based food investigation every week. No fear, no agenda, just science.